I'd like to call meeting of the Budget Review Committee to order. It's Wednesday, June 1st, 2017 at 7 p.m. and we're in the Aldermanic Chamber. Would the clerk please call the roll?
Alderman at Large Laurie Wilshire.
Here.
Alderman at Large Brian McCarthy.
Present.
Alderman at Large Michael O'Brien is present. Alderman David Shoneman.
Here.
Alderman Ken Siegel. Alderman Sean McGinnis is absent. And also in attendance is the committee chair, Richard Dowd. Mayor Jim Donchis is present. And that's it. Yep.
Mr. Fredette
Oh, and Mrs. Fredette,
and
I can
Oh.
introduce.
CFO John Griffin, and, who else?
Got everybody?
nope, missing one.
Kim.
And Kim, Kim's,
Kim and Tim.
Kim and Tim, sorry, excuse me. I'm trying to write it.
Okay. So the first item of business is public comment, but since there are no public here, no one's going to speak. And we have presentations and and I'll just list what they are and then I'll introduce the mayor. The future debt service and the FY18 capital projects, the participatory budgeting and the Arlington Street Community Center. Mayor Donchis.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. As you've already introduced, we have here certainly Treasurer Fredette and CFO Griffin to discuss the bonding schedule. Also, Director Cummings, Economic Development Director, to discuss how participatory budgeting could work. And Ms. Kleiner, Kim Kleiner, who will discuss the Arlington Street Community Center, which is one of the really the smallest items on the capital improvements budget list. But before we turn it over to Mr. Fredette, I wanted just to sort of introduce the subject. He will go through the details, but he will provide you, or has provided you, with a spreadsheet indicating how the debt service could work with respect to two projects that we potentially have on the horizon. One, the Downtown Performing Arts Center, and second, the conversion of the garage, construction of a new garage and office building on Burke Street. For me, this raises some concerns. I know Mr. Fredette has done the best that could be done with respect to showing us how this could work. But if we adopt either of the two schedules, which you will see Mr. Fredette discuss in detail, you will see that the bonded indebtedness budget goes up significantly in year one, year two, and in following years. I think this raises concern because we are going to have the need to keep expenditures under the cap, and any item like this that goes up significantly always creates a cap problem. And number two, of course, always the bottom line being the tax rate. I think we can improve these projects by reducing costs. With respect to the Performing Arts Center, I think we've put in the maximum amount here, but one way we can bring the cost there down, that is in the schedule at a $15 million number, or 15.5, would be to apply for and obtain the new market tax credit support, which is a realistic goal and would result in proceeds for the capital project of conservatively $2 to $3 million, reducing a $15 million item down to 13 or 12. The other project, which is of course a larger project, and Mr. Fredette can get into the details, but it may have to be paced differently or scheduled differently to try to minimize any kind of rapid increase on the tax rate, or we need to focus on the project. After talking with Alderman McCarthy and others, I believe there are ways that we could pare that cost down and still get a reasonable quality project or quality product. Also, one other cautionary measure is that nothing is in here and Mr. Fredette was not asked to include this, so I'm not suggesting he has left anything out. But nothing is in here regarding the riverfront project, which we're talking about. Now, and is coming forward through our riverfront planning exercise and our consultant, Halverson. They put forth, and you'll see the details, but there was a public presentation the other night. They put forward some very exciting things. I know we've talked about doing a TIF, tying the money from the new Rady Sullivan 200-unit project on Franklin Street, tie that into the riverfront improvements directly. That certainly would help, but it may not do everything we want. We don't really know. We don't even have costs yet. But it is something that will, I think, come forward as a important potential community improvement that we at least want to factor in when we're thinking about how we are going to pay for things or how we're going to bond things. So with those caveats, I turn the floor over to our illustrious longtime city treasurer, David Fredette.
Before the city treasurer, Director Marchand, please come join us.
I want to say that Mr. Fredette is always extremely helpful in coming forward with various scenarios and working on ways to pay for things in a way that has the least impact on the tax rate and on the budget. In working with our financial advisor down in Boston, he always comes up with very creative ideas and for us to consider, so I want to thank him for all the work he's done on this project, along with CFO Griffin, who's also been involved.
Okay, Mr. Fredette, I know that you're very frugal over the years, so I'm sure you're portraying very conservative.
Yes, okay. Would you like me to start?
Yes.
Okay. I gave out everybody handouts because some of the sheets on the PowerPoint's a little hard to read. So I blew up the spreadsheets. My eyesight is not too good, so I'm sure others will appreciate that. The first page is strictly what we've reviewed in the past. We do a 6-year outlook on debt needs, and we update it annually. The plan is based on capital improvement plans, department discussions. I talked to department heads on certain plans to see how they think it's going to lay out, and the city's cash flow. The city's outstanding debt has been going down fairly quickly for the last few years, of course, and it's right now would be reduced by about $7.5 million by fiscal year '25. As you know, interest rates are currently favorable. They are expected to rise over the next year and beyond. And all the estimates in these spreadsheets are very conservative. So I would say they are, at least for the first few years, are the worst case scenario. We want to take advantage of the current market rates to the extent possible. None of these calculations include premium payments, and as you know, when we sell our bonds, we get direct cash payments. So that means you actually bond less money. So that helps with the payments also. So I don't have that in here. That's very difficult to determine what you're going to get for premium. And the DPW Operations Center building, which is considered the garage, I guess, that is reflected in here as a 30-year bond. Everything else is 20 years. The next page is fairly key. That is the actual sales plan, and what this reflects is what has been authorized to date, and I have fiscal year 17, so that first column to the left on the authorized, the $12,504,000, that is what we actually sold this year. So those payments on those bonds would begin in fiscal year 18. And then for fiscal year 18 through 23, there is already a few that have been authorized. One is on line 3 is the public health building. That was authorized at least maybe 8 years ago, and we've never done anything with that. That was with Mayor Lozo. Line 6 is the Burke Street property. The city paid 4.2 million for the property. We didn't bond the entire amount because the time that I sold that bond, there was discussion of putting a for-profit organization in the building. And you have different IRS rules on bonds for that, so I didn't sell the entire bond at that time. I plan to sell it in 18, based on the information I have today anyways, that there's no plans to put a for-profit organization in the building. And also, just recently, the board approved the school roofing project for $1.2 million. So those are the current bonds that have all been approved to date to sell, totaling a little over 3.6 million. The bottom half of the page is items that are not authorized, but based on the input in meetings is what I believe is going to be coming in the near future. So, of course, line 15 is, as you know, part of the SURF fund. We budget for some bonded items, the big ticket dollar vehicles. So those are the ones that are in that for the fire department over the next few years. Public health building, I have an additional $2 million in there because I've been told recently that the city now is looking at renovating the current facility, and it's going to take more than 1.2 million to do that. So there's an additional 2 million in the projection. Line 17 is the new project, Burke Street property renovations. That is a total project right now at $50 million, and I have it phased in. The first 2 years includes demolition work and renovation of the office building. The last 2 years, fiscal year 20 and 21, which is the $37 million, that is for what they're calling the operations center. And those 2 years, that bond there, the $37 million, would be the 30-year bond that I sell. Line 18 is another new project, Performing Arts Center, that is $15.5 million. And this is the layout I was given for the projection of how the money is going to get spent. And as you can see, it's over a 3-year period, 4 million, 4 million, 7.5. And then school renovations, that entire line is all related to Elm Street Middle School. So that's about 31,800,000. Fiscal year 19 would include architectural and engineering, and then the rest of it is all the construction of the school. Now, it may take a little less than that, but for planning purposes, this is how I set it out. And other line is really in a line I've always put in that seems year to year we get something that pops up that we never even realized it was coming. So it's for miscellaneous projects. So we usually use that. So that is that line. So that the subtotal for not authorized, as you can see, right now is at 117,643,000. So the subtotal general fund on line 23, those numbers, 20,602 and 11,660, those are the amounts I use for the plan on what we're going to sell each year and at what rate. So this page is key to the whole plan. The next page, which you have in a handout in a bigger format, it's probably easier to read than this. Is a summary of the next 2 pages. And what we did is we took that sales plan that we just reviewed, and we did it based on a deferred principal plan and a no deferral of principal. So as you know, the city usually sells equal principal payments in their bonds. And what happens is your payments start off high and go down. A deferred one is you push out some of the principal in the years, so you try to affect your budget so it's more level increases and not a few big increases in the first few years. It's a process that's used very often. I've used it in the past. And especially when the rates are low, it's good to do that. So as you can see, it shows in column B what the payments would be if we follow the plan all the way down to year 2051. And then in column C, that would be how much the budget would increase or decrease over the years. Now, keep in mind, as we get out 6 years, there's gonna be newer projects coming in for more, so, but as of now, this is how it would look. I should have mentioned in column A, that is what, if we were to sell no other bonds, this is what we would be paying in fiscal year 19 all the way through 37. Those are our amounts due each year. And then D again is the plan to no deferral of principal. And as you can see, in fiscal year 19, the budget would have to increase around 1.3 million. Then only 200 next year, but then 2.4 million the year after. Of course, that's when you're starting to hit the large facility on Burke Street. The difference in cost over 30 years is fairly small over the two plans. The deferral costs about 135,000 extra each year over the 30-year period on an average, which is quite small. The 2 pages behind this are more of the details of each plan. So the page after this, page 4, is the deferred principal payment. As you can see on the top, it shows you the amounts that's gonna be sold each year, and it matches the sales plan. And it shows you the rates that we estimate on the bonds. These rates are conservative. This year, we sold at 2.78. I don't think it will be as high as 3.5 next year, but as again, I budget conservatively. And then it shows you your payments. For the deferred plan, which is here, it would only be the 3 years that we would have to defer some principal. And how we came up with that is I give a target for the budget to our financial advisors, and we work on that to try to match that target. So, again, it shows you in column H what the payments would be if we did the deferred, and how much of the increase would be each year. Now, although it says 591,000 next year, I really believe it would be lower than that, probably by several hundred thousand. But I want to show the worst-case scenario. And what's a little confusing, I just want to make sure, on the top, we would, in fiscal 18, we would sell $20 million, 20.6. But the payments don't hit until fiscal year 19. It's always 1 year later. So, and as you know, we have a very healthy cash flow in the city, so we upfront the project with our own cash, and then we reimburse ourselves back when the bond is sold. So we've been doing that for many years, and it actually works quite well, because today you have all these spending rules when you sell a bond. If you don't spend them in certain amounts of time, you can be penalized by the IRS. And I think I mentioned before, we've had an IRS audit once, and it went really well. So, and we want to keep it that way. Page 5 is the same plan, except no deferral of principal. And again, it shows it by each year, the rates, and column H would show what your payments would be for the total budget, and then how much the budget would increase each year, or decrease. I should mention that these plans are all related to bonds that are paid through the general fund. They're not enterprise bonds in here, and they don't include anything about Penachuk or special revenue. So the bond that was passed recently for paving, you don't see that here, because that's going to be paid for out of special revenue fund. It's not, doesn't hit the operating budget. So that's what is reflected on these sheets. And the last page I just included because Alderman McCarthy asked about this when we came on May 18th. What is the debt limits and how do we fall under that? And as you can see, we're extremely low. I mean, the debt limits are we probably would never reach that. It's unaffordable, probably. But anyways, we are very low. And actually, our debt service budget for a city this size is low. And if you look on, at one time, we were up to 19 million. Well, now, this year, we're at 16.3. A city this size really should have something over 20 anyways, each year to keep reinvesting in infrastructure. But over the years, we have the rates have been so low and we have refunded so much, that helped a lot with getting the budget down over the last few years. But there's really nothing left to refund. We've done all of it over the last 6, 7 years. So that's my presentation, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you. Questions? Alderman McCarthy?
Yeah, couple of things. I actually first agree with you. We had problems many years ago with not having anywhere near enough money in the capital part of the budget. We were down around 3% of the city budget. The healthy number for most communities is around 10%, as I understand it. So I'm very loath to let it go down much, particularly with looking at what it's going to do over the next 10 years. I mean, it looks to me, even with those three projects in, 30 million for Elm Street, 50 for the garage, and 15 for the Art Center, when we get out to 2025, we see a drop of 1.25 million and then 1.75 million the year after, which we could, in those 2 years, let about 50 million more in debt and keep the bond number flat at that point, I believe. So we're actually in very good shape for the long term. In the short term, I understand there's some concern about the increases, but they actually look to be, I mean, they're in the order of $500,000 a year over 5 years, and then it starts to drop off again. I do notice things though, like you have 3 million in there in FY18 for other debt initiation. If that doesn't happen and we don't let another 3 million, then the $591,000 number in FY18 or 19 comes down by, like, I think it's around 250,000 if we don't let $3 million in debt in that year, correct?
Yes.
So, I mean, I think the schedule as you've presented it to us is very manageable, particularly if we're careful about, one, the costs on some of those projects, and two, what else we bond. I'm looking out particularly to 2025 because the second half of the paving that we'll have to figure out in that time frame, we can afford, even if we have to do it as GO bonds that are paid out of the budget, not out of the pavement trust fund. So I think this is actually a very good plan. I think it provides us with an ability to get the infrastructure back to where it ought to be. Between this and the paving bonds, we're actually producing a fairly nice community for our constituents.
Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to say,
Yes.
one of the reasons why the other is a little higher than I used to put is this year during the capital improvements committee meetings, I've noticed schools, fire, police, and the library all have a lot of backed up deferred maintenance. So I thought maybe I could try to put something together for all those groups, and maybe we could sell a bond for all that, because it just doesn't go away. It keeps growing every year, that deferred maintenance. It's something I mentioned to the mayor briefly, so I'm not sure how that would go, but they all have quite a bit of deferred maintenance, those groups.
And I do think we need to do some work on Court Street, no matter what we do, to make it habitable, basically, and useful. So that is another piece we're gonna have to look at.
Alderman Schoenman, then Alderman Siegel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. May I ask a question about this deferred principal and no deferral of principal? When we buy the bond, do we lock that plan in, or is this something that we decide from year to year? And what is the downside to deferring the principal? Presumably, there is some downside. There's a risk associated with rates, or is there no risk?
No, the rates are locked in. That's locked in the year you sell. The
Okay,
downside is over a 30-year or 20-year period, you do pay a little more. But like I said, on the average, it was about $135,000 a year.
but there's no risk of the change in that
No,
schedule?
it's locked when you sell.
Okay. Another question, please? Thank you. On the last page, the graph, the legal debt limits, I'm curious, how is the city and school debt limit set? You mentioned that we would never go that high and that would be unaffordable. If it's unaffordable, why does it even exist as a limit? Where does that limit come from?
Well, the state has a limit, and it's based on your assessed value of the city. And it says on the bottom there on the sheet, the state allows you 3% of the assessed value of the city and 7 for schools, but the city over the years adopted a little stricter policy, and the city's policy is 2% for city, 6% for schools. So that's how that line, as you can see it go down, the reason why it goes down there in the 2008, you know what happened, we lost, about $1.5 billion of valuation, and then it's starting to go up again. So that's why you see the line going down and up. So that's how that's how the law reads. It's based on your total assessed value of the community.
And our limits, the city limits, and the school, the ones that we set, are more conservative than the state, but it's still an unaffordable level.
Well, that's up to each person. I think it would be, in my opinion, it would be, but, I mean, that's a lot of money. You know, you'd be paying big payments at that time if you went up to the top. But
So maybe the actual affordable limit would be somewhere between where we're at and that big black line up there.
yeah, I would say.
Okay, thank you.
Alderman Siegel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So one of the major items that's on here, I mean, we have a big spike, and it's Burke Street. I know we're accounting for it, but I got to ask myself, at that price, why are we doing it? The idea was somehow, well, we need a consolidated depot to service our equipment and a wash bay, and we need to have, you know, indoor storage. And for that amount of money, I just don't see how it'll be cost effective at this point. I mean, when we were first envisioning buying the land and putting that up, we were nowhere near that amount of money, so.
President McCarthy?
Yeah, unfortunately, the cost of doing nothing is not zero. I mean, we have a garage that a lot of the vehicles are housed in now. That garage is pretty close to end of life. It's, the structural steel has some problems, footings have problems, we've done repairs on it, and I think the numbers that we've looked at, even just doing repairs to get that back into reasonable shape, come to on the order of 20 million. And that doesn't put all of the vehicles inside, and it doesn't give us the wash facility, plus it doesn't free up the space that building is on for other uses. So the additional cost we're looking at for Burke Street is not 50 million, it's smaller because, you know, there is a large incremental cost that we have to pay to move over there, but it's not 50 million, it's 50 million minus what we would have had to do to stay on Riverside and to deal with the fact that the trash trucks are outside and, you know, we don't have good maintenance facilities and those other things.
Okay, I appreciate it. A follow-up question.
Follow-up?
How do we fit this under the cap in that year? I mean, it seems like, well, we take a tremendous spike in the interest. Is that cap debt?
Well, the spending cap allows you to exempt debt service, although I know hasn't been done in quite a few years, but it has been done.
Okay. It's a big spike that year.
The mayor wanted to chime in, but did you want to address or?
I was just going to respond to Alderman McCarthy before on the issue of deferred principal, kind of an interest-only approach to part of the debt for a certain period of time. In former days, we always took a more conservative approach. I mean, we always bonded flat premium payments, flat principal payments, which means if you are borrowing $1 million, say, over 20 years, you pay off $50,000 the first year, $50,000 the second, which does bring your interest costs down over time. Unlike like a car loan where you've got like an even payment for a certain number of years. Now, through discussions with Mr. Fredette, Alderman McCarthy, I've been brought around a little bit to the I see some of the advantages of the deferred principal approach, but it does limit. But you have, it does limit your flexibility in the sense that, it helps you even out the payments, but it means that, in year 5, your principal, say, as an example, your principal payments go up. What if something happens in year 5? You have less flexibility to be able to respond with new needs or things that come up. I mean, that's the disadvantage of the deferred principal approach. Again, I've been brought around to see some of the advantages of it. but it can be overdone. Let me put it that way, at least in my opinion.
Nolan McCarthy?
Yeah, first of all, in the time I've been on the board, I don't think we have ever paid a principal payment in year one. We have always done them so that we let the bond in 1 year, sell it at the end of the year, and pay a single interest-only payment in the second half of the next fiscal year, so that the first principal payment is actually 2 years out from when we let the bond. And coupled with the fact that we have often funded projects completely out of the fund balance and not let the bond for an additional year, we have pushed things out. And I think it's just a question of figuring out how to make it flat in the predictions and making ourselves happy with what the numbers look like over time. We'll always have to deal, I mean, if you go to flat principal payments, like, okay, 5 years from now, we may not be able to respond to some other problem. If we'd been on flat principal payments, we wouldn't have been able to anyway, because that already would have been in the budget. So, with regard to the spike that it has for the cap, given that the debt number is up around 16 or 17 million, the cap even this year would anticipate an increase of about 200,000. So we're looking at numbers that are between, the additional cap burden is around 400,000 a year in the first few years of this bond.
Relative to the Burke Street property, a couple things. One, I think Mr. Fredette also mentioned that he's being very conservative, and prices may be high. The numbers you have here may be higher than what's actually spent. But looking at it from a life cycle cost standpoint, it's a 30-year bond, not a 20-year bond. And if you amortize all of the elements of a business case analysis for that building, I think you'd find that it's fairly reasonable. Alderman Schoen?
Thank you. Are we doing such a study as that? Are we taking a look at the anticipated costs year by year by year by year on Burke Street and any other projects? It seems that we tend to look at the project at the beginning and say, it's worth it, and we hear things like, well, it's going to save us money in the long run, but we never see numbers that show that it saves us money in the long run. I'm just wondering if we're doing something like that to the best of your knowledge.
When it first came up, I sat down with the previous mayor and we did a back of the envelope type thing, and the numbers looked pretty reasonable. Of course, numbers have changed, and we didn't do a formal one. It's certainly, I wouldn't spend a ton of money doing it, but you could certainly get a reasonable estimate.
If I may.
Is it a follow-up? Because the mayor.
Sure, I just would just ask then, if, as we're doing these things, if we could do a formal analysis as we consider some of these things in the future, so we can take a look and see what the cost difference would be.
Mayor?
Thank you.
I just wanted to mention that on Burke Street, I think everybody has heard this or seen it, but there are basically three parts to the project. There is first the office building, the restoration of the office building for use possibly by the school department and by Public Works is number one. That's assigned about a $10 million cost. Next, as the architects have looked at the garage, it's really not feasible to save what is there. So and really it's best long-term to demolish what is there as opposed to trying to save it. So number two, the second part of the Burke Street project is the demolition of the existing garage at an estimated cost we have at this point of about $2 million. And then third is the construction of a new garage, new barn, so to speak, which now has a cost of $38 million or 37, totaling 49 to 50 million. Those things can be taken one at a time, or especially the first two can be done first, meaning the office building, the conversion is probably the most urgent thing because the building can deteriorate if we don't do something with an office building that we eventually are going to occupy. Number two urgency is probably the demolition of the garage, because we, of course, get a step closer to building a new garage, and because we eliminate the carrying costs of the current structure, which if we're not going to save it, we should get rid of. And then third is the construction of the garage, of a new garage from the ground up.
So just a couple things. One of the things you'd find in that type of study would be the school department has to come up with a building for their school in Merrimack next year. And part of the plan was to move them down to Burke Street, if this is still valid, and use the current office building, the school office building for that school for Merrimack. So you don't have to build another building. There's a savings. And the other thing, I don't know if anybody's looked at it, but there's a lot of steel in that existing building. We looked at the cost of selling that steel to offset cost of the building.
I think Alderman McCarthy's very familiar.
I don't know that there, I mean, there's some salvage value to it. I don't know that it's that much.
Be interesting to know what that number is.
And let me mention, Mr. Chair, the reason that the current building cannot really be retrofitted is as we went through that analysis, and Alderman McCarthy, Alderman Dean, and Commissioner BPW Commissioner Bergeron were very involved. So Alderman McCarthy can elaborate. But as we went through, we got a report which says, okay, it'll cost 40-some million for this project, and you'll get a garage where you have no drains in the floor, in a public works facility where there's water all over the place. And number two, so you'll be squeegeeing the floor. And number two, the roof won't be strong enough to hold a full snow load, so you need to then be prepared to shovel the roof. So I think it just seemed to us that, like, why, we're going to spend $40 million to build something where we've got to shovel the roof when we don't have any drains. So that just seemed crazy. So in terms of long-term investments, so it seemed best to use the office building and retain its value, but in terms of the garage itself, to go to the ground and start all over again.
Also, as was pointed out last night, we originally get into this to make sure we had the land for the sewage treatment plant to expand. So that would have cost us a heck of a lot more if we had not bought Burke Street. So there's that difference in price too. So you add all these things up, it may not be as expensive as one thinks, relatively speaking.
Can I add one more thing?
Mayor?
Just in terms of the original decision, we were operating, yes, on numbers regarding the reconstruction of the garage that were much lower. But I think Director Cummings can tell you that we've received, that if we wanted to sell that building, and I'm not suggesting we should, because I think, because of the reason you mentioned, the expansion of the treatment plant, all these other reasons, we want to keep the property. But if we did want to sell it, we could sell it today for more than we bought it for. So in terms of our decision to go forward, it was still a good decision, even though the garage turned out to be a much harder project than we originally, or whoever was looking at it at the time, originally anticipated.
Okay. Alderman McCarthy?
Yeah, I guess first I'd point out if we sell it for more than we bought it for, I think we get into some fairly large arbitrage problems on the bonds that we're carrying on it now. Like, we have to pay every penny of it in taxes and penalties. So it's not like we're gonna make the treasury right by selling it. I'm not convinced that in the end, we save money if we renovate the building. I think it's not as bad as it looks on paper, and the operation of the department is certainly a lot better because we have better spaces to work in. We keep the trucks cleaner. You gotta look at things like, do we get an extra year out of the trash trucks because they're indoors and we're washing the salt out of them? And if every vehicle that's in the SURF plan lasts one more year than we think it will, well, in theory, that saves us 1 year of funding SURF, which is several $1 million, so that, and that stuff adds up. And the fact that we have the plows indoors where they're easy to put on and take off. We have the staff working indoors where it's not 10 degrees during ice storms. I think all of those things, you know, some of those are not tangible, but they have value to the operation. So I wouldn't say we're gonna make money by doing it, but I would say that the investment is probably worth it in the long run.
Alderman Shoneman?
Thank you. I agree. I think some of those costs certainly are intangibles, and they're worth it. But as we move forward with anything like this, I think we want to make sure that there's some level of accountability, so that at least there's a piece of paper somewhere that says, when we made this decision, we said the SURF account was going to move all these vehicles out by 1 year, and then, or whatever it is, so that you look at it later and see, do we actually do that or not? Because it's not, I don't think it's right to just speculate. Not that it's just speculation, but if we have it written down, then we can say, yep, we did it, or no, we didn't. And I just think that's a reasonable approach to take.
Okay. Alderman O'Brien?
Well, I was just going to say, looking at the existing building, I agree it needs to come down. But are we also looking at, is it the right place to build a garage? Now, the existing building is very close to the sewer treatment plant, and looking at that. And so if we're looking at future expansion, we taken the sewage treatment plant, are we taking that into account? If we demolish the garage, we gain more ground. If we build it on the other side of the office, we might be a little bit better. Are we looking at that as part of the process?
I would say, given the layout of the building and the space we have, which is 30 acres, we do, even reconstructing the garage where it exists, there would clearly be enough space for the expansion of the sewage treatment plant where when that's required.
Alderman Shoneman?
Thanks. One other question. I agree that we don't want to, I mean, I think it was a good decision to buy the building for all the reasons that we talked about last year. But I am curious about the value of the building, if we were to sell it, if we get more for it or not. How is that value affected? And I understand the problems with selling it, but how is that value affected by the presence of that garage or the absence of it? Does the value go down because it's no longer there, because someone would want that? Or does it go up because someone would prefer vacant land? Again, I just wanting to know, what are we doing to our value as it sits there on the ground before we build something else just by taking it down?
I'm going to defer this to Alderman McCarthy, but my guess is that if we sold that building, we'd have to sell the office building part of it with it. And now we got a problem with the school department needing another building. So I'm not sure those numbers add up.
Well, I guess, I mean, from the discussion we went through when we bought it, I think there is value in the building itself, and in fact, Director Cummings can correct me if I'm wrong, but I suspect to anyone looking at the property, the building is probably most of the value. It's, the site has not great accessibility from the highway, which makes it, you know, which is one of the reasons it's vacant, and one of the reasons the buildings around it are vacant. So somebody might buy it because it is a large building in what appears to be move-in condition. I wouldn't be surprised if during due diligence during the sale, someone backed out of a deal with us when they discovered the things that we now know about the building. It requires a lot of work to the mechanical systems. The heating system is in very bad shape. The heating system must be on because the sprinkler system is wet. So you got to keep the building above freezing in the winter. You know, if they're not using it for vehicle storage, then the floor may be fine for them. It's got the crane, which is kind of cool, you know, if you're doing stuff that requires that. But I think that a lot of it is just, you'd be catching somebody who saw it as an opportunity because it's there and it exists, not because the land is of tremendous value to them.
Mr. Cummings?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to continue on to Alderman McCarthy's point, and because my name was brought up just a few moments ago, I just wanted to make sure I clarified. That particular site is one of the only sites that I have received a few unsolicited phone calls from commercial brokers on over the last year, and it's to exactly Alderman McCarthy's point. The building, its size, its ceiling clearance makes it very attractive. The most recent phone call I took was actually from a Connecticut owner of RV sales, and he was looking to store his RV program that he's looking to develop up in northern New England, and this one site was something that could be accommodating for his needs. So to the mayor's point, there is interest that I've received, but no due diligence has been done, and I think when the due diligence does happen, there might be some concerns raised, but there is definitely a value due to the type of building that it is.
Alderman Shoneman?
Again, here we are just speculating, but if we were to ever go down that route, would it be possible to carve off a piece of land for wastewater treatment and expansion, and then sell what's left? Would that ever be an option, or is it the proximity of the building too close to the edge? What do we think?
So I would defer to Director Marchant, but I believe it's something that could be done.
Director Marcia?
Thank you. I do think there's some concerns with floodplain in carving off the boundary there. So I think it would have to be done carefully, but could it be done? Absolutely.
Thank you.
Just for clarification, Alderman McCarthy, you brought up something about the bond if we tried to sell the building. Could you elaborate on the ramifications to the city?
Yeah, I mean, when we take out bonds that are non-taxable, the expectation is that we're going to do the project that we're taking out for and maintain it and keep the benefit of that. So if you do anything that looks like you took out a municipal bond and used it to turn a profit, the IRS takes a very dim view of that.
For that, you want to elaborate on that, since that, you'd probably be the focus of that?
I've never experienced since all the time I've been here, but yes, that would be a concern.
Okay.
We may have to pay a penalty of some kind. I don't know.
For example, if we take out a bond and simply leave the proceeds in an interest-bearing account in the bank for over 2 years, we get whacked with a penalty that basically eradicates any profit you may have made by holding the money.
Right, okay. Other questions about the bonding? Mr. Griffin?
Mr. Chairman, John Griffin, Chief Financial Officer. Been a lot of discussion, a lot of healthy discussion, but I think for the purposes of the budget impact, just wanted to share some observations. First of all, if you look at the budget schedule, as Mr. Fredette, Treasurer Fredette indicated, we had a peak in 2008 of about 19 million. By the fact that we were pretty much cautious since '08 into the early 2010 and 11, we didn't borrow as much to replace that debt service requirement. So we've essentially reduced the debt service about 3 million over that time. And if you think about the last 2 or 3 budgets, we've left, one year we left 100,000 under the cap, another year we left 50,000 under the cap. Where I'm going with this is we've kind of funded the ongoing operations of the budget with reductions in debt service. In addition, as you know, we're proposing a $3.6 million increase to benefits. And if you look at how we've effectively managed the benefits of the city, we did a great job, both the city itself and the employees, by accepting more costs on their backs. That's another way we've managed effectively the other increases, namely pension. So I've been tracking the spending cap index. It's a 3-year trailing average. At this time, it looks like, assuming a 2% inflation for calendar 17, it might be a 1.6% spending cap number for next year, which is $4 million. So as Alderman Shoneman asked Director Budrow, does he see any kind of increase in benefits? I would say that would be likely. I think the use of the fund balance is probably over at this time. It's a very healthy 10 to 11 million. So we kind of look at these things in chunks, 600,000. Let's assume it's 500,000. You take 500,000, you maybe have a 3% on a $27 million benefit fund. You've got wages that have been already bargained. You have wages to be bargained. You have pensions on those wages. So the 4 million goes very quickly. I think as you go through the process, looking at this in isolation may not be the way to go, and I think that was some of the hesitancy of Mayor Donchis at the front end that although this looks like an attractive, affordable way of going with the deferred principal and getting things that you desperately need, putting all the stuff in the meat grinder, I think everybody needs to understand all the levers that are going to go up and down. And I think if we look back to the November 10th, 2016 budget summit, a lot of the discovery, you know, we asked the police department, the fire department, the school department, what could you do if you had a level budget? And they came back with their ideas at that time, as you recall. That's not a one-time exercise. That's a continuing exercise. So if you just add the numbers up quickly, wages and benefits might be in the $2 million range. We have put $2 million plus in the contingency for negotiations this year that's in the proposed budget. So I think between the wages, pension related to the wages, benefits, and bonding increases, I think you need, those are the things you need to put all in the meat grinder and then decide something like this, as Treasurer Fredette says, you could, just like was done in the early 2000s with the schools, there was a decision, okay, I'm going to bond the schools, and I'm also going to exclude the debt service associated with it. Otherwise, I think you're putting a tremendous strain on the spending cap calculation and everything underneath it. So I just wanted to share that perspective. This is a beginning of the process as I look at it, but my understanding of some of these things, they've got timing, like the Performing Arts Center has timing. As Alderman McCarthy says, we have to do something to replace our aging infrastructure. So I just wanted to leave that with you folks. Thank you.
Alderman McCarthy?
Yeah, I also want to make a point about the declining debt service number. If I go back to when it used to be very small, we inched it up a little bit over time when we did some of the projects, but I think it's worth noting that it never could have gotten to where it is if we didn't have the rather serendipitous windfall of the Claremont decision. When Claremont happened and we started receiving the state aid to education, the natural progression would have been for the tax rate to go down by about $4. Instead of doing that, we held that decrease to about $2 and funded the school capital reserve fund at $11 million a year for the first 2 years. We then replaced that $11 million in the budget with the debt service on the $100 million of bonding for the 2 high schools, which is how it got to where it is. If it gets back down to where it's 3% of the budget instead of 10, we'll never, in all likelihood, get back to the point where we can afford to keep up the infrastructure again.
The other thing is, property values are increasing, and so at some point, the assessed value of the city will go up, which will lower the percent of bonding in relationship to the assessed value. So we'd be even in a better position relative to percentages than we are today. So I can tell you that property values are not going down, they're going up as we speak. And I don't know where it's gonna plateau, but I'm hoping somebody's keeping track of that in the citywide.
The assessing department is.
Yeah. Okay, anything else relative to bonding? All right. Next, FY18 capital projects. Mayor, do you want to kick that off again, or?
Yes, Mr. Chair, thank you very much. Well, first of all, I know you've been through the capital projects already, so I think we are here to focus on a couple of them. The first being participatory budgeting, and the proposed participatory budgeting, and the second being the Arlington Street Community Center. Director Cummings is going to talk about participatory budgeting and the advantages that it might have for the city. Director Marchand can just supplement that with a direct experience she had when she went to a planning conference in New York with respect to the participatory budgeting exercise there. But let me correct a couple of misunderstandings at the beginning. Number one, this is not an increase in spending. If you look at the cap, every year we have a capital budget where we do various projects out of current funds, swimming pools, fix a bridge, sidewalks, put money into deferred maintenance projects, schools, city hall, things like that. Last year's budget was about $1.2 million for capital improvements, as I've described. This year's budget is about the same. So it is not an increase in spending. It is a different way of deciding which of many, many, many capital improvements that we could make, a different way in bringing those forth and proposing them. Now, Alderman McCarthy has pointed out that in the end, were we to adopt this approach, we would still need Board of Aldermen approval for each project, and that is correct. Even if we allocated money to this, we still would need Board of Aldermen approval. But we have precedent within our own government regarding this. We give the Citizens Advisory Committee a lot of, well, basically absolute, a lot of discretion to decide how our social service dollars are spent, and then we come forward and propose their set of recommendations, and at least since I've been mayor before and now, I mean, I don't alter those, and the board rarely does either. Number two, we have the Downtown Improvements Committee, where they recommend how money should be spent. Now, despite the skepticism, I think that this offers some advantages. First of all, it gets a lot more people involved. Number two, if you look at the areas where they do this, Vallejo, California, Hartford, Cambridge, Boston, New York, it is an extremely popular program. A lot of people get involved and they really like it. These are the citizens. New York allocates, and New York is a huge city, but $5 million to each council district, an area not that much bigger than Nashua, and they decide on neighborhood-based projects. When what comes forward in these exercises is projects that none of us have thought about, but which to the citizens mean something. Fix a sidewalk, put in, fix a community center. These are not necessarily Nashua-specific examples. Put in an outdoor bathroom, things like this that no one has thought about, but the citizens come forward and propose ideas which are quite creative and which other people have not thought about. It is not an increase in spending. The way it works now, the mayor, me, proposes the projects to you 100%, and that's how it works. Yes, we have to review capital projects through the Capital Improvements Committee, but that's all. I'm not required to follow their recommendations, and sometimes I do and sometimes I don't. So I propose the projects to you, and you decide whether you want to pass them. So yes, were we to use a process that allowed citizens to propose, I'm proposing here 200,000 out of $1.2 million, it could be a smaller number. But if we were to adopt an approach that allows citizens to come forward with some of these ideas, which we would then consider and potentially endorse, yeah, I give up a little authority, because right now I propose all the projects. And if you look at last year's capital improvements budget, the Board of Aldermen didn't alter any of them. So really, I'm the one. Yes, you had to adopt what I proposed, but I proposed and you adopted, and you did not alter anything. So in last year's budget cycle, I'm the one that decided which capital improvements should be included, and you guys went along because I guess you agreed with that wisdom. But yeah, we do cede a little authority, but I'm doing the same, and were this to be adopted, you would as well, over a small portion of our capital improvements budget. So I'm just trying to correct the misimpressions that this is not an increase in spending. It's a different way of proposing and considering projects, number one. Number two, I don't really think in a meaningful way we're giving up authority, because we're including more people, we're making it more community-based, and we are gaining a community benefit by doing it this way. Now, that doesn't mean you have to agree. I'm not saying that a reasonable person couldn't decide this isn't a good idea, but I'm just trying to create some of the, correct some of the misimpressions, probably because it wasn't explained that well at the beginning, as to how this would work. But in any event, with that, much longer than I'd really anticipated. I'm going to turn it over to Director Cummings.
Otherwise known as Don
Director
Quixote.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm going to keep my remarks very brief this evening, and more of what I'd like to do is for the edification of the general public, and that is to talk about what exactly participatory budgeting is. And at the very elementary level, it is a process where it's a democratic process where deliberation and decision-making and a type of participatory democracy for ordinary people within the community have the ability to allocate either part or some of the municipal budget. It allows citizens to identify, discuss, and prioritize public spending and projects, and hopefully empowers them to feel like they're making real decisions on how the money is spent. So at the very core steps is community members identify spending priorities. They develop specific spending proposals with the helps of consultants and experts and municipal staff. Then community members vote on the proposals once the projects have been vetted. And then ultimately the city implements and tries to execute upon said proposals. So that is essentially a very high-level overview of what participatory budgeting is. Essentially what you have in front of you this evening, beyond the memo that was included in your packet, I have provided you just a quick thumbnail one-pager of how the participatory budgeting process could work here in the city, which essentially outlines a timeline starting this summer, the July-August timeframe of basically information sessions, public meetings, begin the outreach process, collect ideas. From the midsummer into the early fall, there would be the development of the proposals. City staff would vet and ensure that the proposals are executable. Moving on into the mid-fall to the early winter, we would develop a mechanism for proposals to be voted on, ultimately concluding in November to December time period for the conclusion of the participatory budgeting process season, lining up nicely for going into an RFP after the first of the year, ultimately trying to hit a spring-type construction season. So in addition to that one pager, you also have a booklet on your desks, which is put out by the Participatory Budgeting Project, which is a nonprofit organization that has helped bring forward this concept to municipalities across North America. This is not a unique concept that was developed. It has been implemented actually across the United States and in the world at large, and has been very successful thus far. In the memo, which has been provided in your packet, I've taken the opportunity to outline some of the communities thus far that have entertained this type of program. The comparable communities that I would want to highlight is Pawtucket, Rhode Island is actually in the process of adopting this initiative. Hartford, Connecticut is another community that is adopting this initiative, and Vallejo, California as well. So communities comparable to the city of Nashua are moving forward with this type of program. It is a great program in terms of trying to bring a higher level of citizens' engagement, which I think is always a good thing. And it helps bring energy and volunteerism to the city overall. With that, Mr. Chairman, I would be more than happy to answer any questions.
Okay.
Just ask Ms. Marchand to briefly.
I was just going to do the same thing, since she just went to
Since
a
she's-
conference, if she wanted to add before we
face
get
the
into it.
questions.
Director Marchand.
Sure, thank you. So as part of the National Planning Conference was in New York City this year, and so I spent one day in Brooklyn, in the Sunset Park District, where they have been doing participatory budgeting for about 3 years. They, as Mayor suggested, the district councilors in each district get about $5 million allocation. This district counselor puts 2 million towards it every year. They have successfully increased public participation with each round of voting by about 3,000 people, which is pretty significant. So 9,000 at the most recent vote. This is a very well. It's a nice neighborhood right on the edge of. Right on the edge of the water. It goes up the hill. It has an industrial base and then builds up housing and then this park at the top. It is 1/3 English speaking, 1/3 Spanish speaking, and 1/3 Mandarin. So they have a diverse population, which has been very difficult to engage all levels of. And participatory budgeting has focused on doing everything in all 3 languages and really engaging a lot of the different community groups and bringing them to the forefront of the table to make it move forward. They have funded through this process in these last couple of years some really interesting projects that weren't necessarily in the government's idea of their highest priorities. For example, one of the schools, they funded putting emergency egress doors in all the schools as their #1 priority. This was something that they wanted to use the schools year-round, and they have overcrowding of those schools, and they couldn't fix that problem. But they felt that if they invested in the quick access, the quick egress doors, that was something that they could do. It was super important to the neighborhoods, and it brought a lot of groups together to vote that in. And they were able to complete that within the year, which was like a low-hanging fruit project, so that they got a lot more buy-in, and people showed up and really appreciated that. Other examples are a couple segments of street that people thought the paving needed significant improvement. That's what they wanted to do. They improved handball courts. They actually chose to invest in replacing all the police cameras around the park because that was very important to people in this neighborhood. So there's been a variety of things they've been able to do with this funding. And I think some of the most important things they've found out of it is that the people who get involved in participatory budgeting, PB, this might be their first foray into understanding civics and government and to participating, and they tend to come back and volunteer. And they volunteer in more capacities, and they get more involved, and they start to understand the budget process. So one of the people who was leading the tour, who was pretty phenomenal, works for the district counselor, and she said, now when people call and they're like, why haven't you fixed this? Why hasn't this gotten done? And you can explain a bit of the budget process, they say, oh, I understand. And it's an education process for everybody, but it helps everybody get on the same page and they understand the process. And all right, then I'm going to bring forward this project next year in my participatory budgeting. And you build consensus within the neighborhood. It builds community, and it also builds activity within civic government. So it was pretty very interesting tour, and very interesting to see it in place.
Okay. Alderman Siegel and Alderman McCarthy.
I'll let Alderman McCarthy go first.
Alderman McCarthy.
I have no objection to having a process to get public input. I think that's probably a really good thing to have. But where I have the problem is in pre-allocating the funding before we see the projects. And I guess my reaction when I first saw this, and the question I asked the mayor was, so if the public input group suggests that what we really need is a handicapped access playground in the middle of Greeley Park, what's going to happen to that in the funding process? And I suspect I knew the answer to that. It was kind of rhetorical, but it's just, we don't have the guts to depoliticize this completely. So it seems to me that getting the ideas and putting them into the process, yeah, it takes a year longer if you got to fund them up front, if you got to fund them afterwards, but that vetting is going to take place anyway. So I guess, I'm not adverse to having the projects come in, but frankly, also, I just don't know where we're going to get the money to do anything meaningful when we can't put enough cops on the street. I mean, you mentioned Hartford just put this in place. Hartford has a tax rate of $20.38, which is higher than ours, I believe, and a 6.5% income tax to fund education at the state level. So Hartford does not have a budget that is capped the way ours is. It's substantially higher in terms of what they can put in as total resources. New York has an income tax, a sales tax, outrageously high real estate taxes and much higher density of real estate per square foot, which is, I think, you see this a lot in cities where there's a lot of vertical height because the assessment ratio to square feet you could put improvements on is very large compared to the city of Nashua. So I'm just not sure that it scales correctly. I think it's a great idea to have a way to get, public input to do things. Some of the projects you mentioned, Director Marchand, are things, our schools already have
Understood.
ample egress because we do that by code and just by nature. So, and some of those projects are things that I would expect us to be doing. I think getting the ideas for, gee, we really could use something over here, this could be redone. Those are the things where the people who are on the street and see that all the time know what the problems are in the neighborhood, whereas we may not see that. And the suggestions for improvements, I think that's a great idea. I have issues with currently finding that anything that comes out of that is going to be of higher priority than the things we can't put in the budget to begin with. I had asked you when you came in for budget, what would you do if you had more money? And you had suggested that master planning was something that we really ought to do. Is that a better use of the $200,000 than the projects we would get from a public input process at this point in Nashua's history? That's my concern with the project.
Director Cummings would like to comment if you want to defer to him.
Sure.
Director Cummings?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just three points I wanted to make quickly. It's my understanding that the current budget is reflective of last year's budget in terms of the capital improvement budget. So it would be, the same type of budget. We're just allocating the current budget a little bit differently. Vetting of projects, there's a big concern, and that's why within the memo that you received, it talks about the city staff vetting and making sure these projects are actually executable because of the very concern that you actually raised, Alderman McCarthy. That was actually my initial thought when I first heard about this concept as well. I first thought was Greeley Park. And then lastly, relative to size, I just wanted to point out that, again, in the memo, I actually included a community that was much smaller, the town of Hinton, Canada. A town of 10,000 actually participates in this process. I point these elements out only to suggest that this is a way we can move forward, and it is different, and I understand change is scary, but it's something that I would be excited to be involved with.
Alderman Siegel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'm going to address a whole lot of different things. First, I do respect the mayor, and I do believe this was an honest attempt to provide some input, and I also believe this is not a spending increase. But it is a prioritization of funding in a certain way that I think is not appropriate for us to go through. So a couple of observations. One, all of this spending didn't come through the mayor as a sole entity, okay? The staff collectively comes up with a variety of suggestions, and the mayor proposes the budget as the executive. So I think it's not one person. This isn't like North Korea, thankfully, and all.
Suggests it's a dictatorship.
I understand, and I was just about to say,
Or a
nor would I ever,
totalitarian one, at
nor,
that.
and I was about to say, nor would I ever say that our mayor is anything even remotely like that. We have a very good setup. So there is that. We also already have a mechanism by which we have participatory budgeting in a sense, and that's somebody calls their alderman and says, I'd really like this project. Is there any way we can get this done? And a lot of times we propose legislation and we try to get things done, like Greeley Park, which was legislation, albeit and thankfully failed. The other thing is, there's a notion, it's all well and good. I believe people may come up with very good ideas that appeal to them. But collectively in this horseshoe, there's a lot of knowledge about what's really happening under the surface. And that is our job. I mean, right now, the Police Expendable Trust Fund for overtime is near zero. We just found out about the radios, and that's an important expenditure. There's any number of high priority items which the average citizen is going to be completely unaware of, which are orders of magnitude more important than, you know, hey, let's have a nice little wading pond wherever, you know, for example. And it's all, and I understand the concept of trying to participate, but there is participation. We are elected officials, and we are accountable to our constituents. And I'm sure my colleagues get as many phone calls or more than I do, and we do hear it. So there is that. The other thing was mentioned is the Downtown Improvement Committee. I might point out I sponsored legislation to eliminate that, that fund. And this specific reason had nothing to do with some animosity towards the downtown. It was specifically because of the idea of earmarking a chunk of money for a specific purpose when the city as a whole may have had other needs. And that was it. I mean, I think that people do a good job with it, but it is within that narrow context that doesn't always fit in with the wider needs of the city. Like the downtown would probably be more improved if we had more police, for example, but that's never part of the spending. And right now I can tell you that we could try to increase the police budget, but it's hard enough for them to recruit as it is. And given that that's the case, that expendable trust fund for overtime is more than a little critical. Like we better replace that. So these are the kinds of things that cross my mind, and while I believe this is well-intentioned, I absolutely do not support this at all.
Alderman Schoenman?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the comments by the previous speakers, and I share a lot of them. The notion of participation in government, I think, is really, really important. I like that a lot. I come in here all the time and I talk about what constituents say, what taxpayers say. It's very, very important to me. Frankly, I'm a little disappointed at sometimes that people don't really pay as much attention as they should. They don't get as involved as they ought to. And this represents an opportunity to let that happen more. But shouldn't our entire government be participatory? That's what self-government's all about. We're not supposed to be here voicing just our own concerns. We're supposed to be here representing the people that sent us here. In a way, by saying, here's $200,000, we're sort of saying, the rest of it isn't for you. Here's $200,000 that can be for you. That's because of the value associated with it, the $200,000. I think having a mechanism for getting public input that's not associated with a dollar value, I think can accomplish some of those things. We do listen to people. We have all kinds of forums upstairs, and we have ward meetings, these kinds of things. We want to hear from people. I think it's very, very important. Alderman McCarthy made a point about the politicization of the funds. And I think that's something to bear in mind too. If we were to do something like this, would there be new people involved, or would it be some of the same groups? We already have a lot of volunteers in New Hampshire, and certainly in the city of Nashua too. A lot of people volunteer for a lot of things. And I wonder if some of those same folks would be involved in that process. We have people that serve on multiple commissions and boards, for instance. So while I really believe in participatory budgeting, or in participatory government, I should say, I think that we should find a mechanism that doesn't necessarily have a dollar value associated with it as a fund ready to spend, but ask folks, what do they want from us? That's what we should be doing anyway. What do you want? What do you think Nashua should do? I have a feeling that if we were to really have some of those conversations, maybe some of our spending wouldn't be quite the same. And I think it's important to listen to them, but I don't like the $200,000 piece associated with it. Thank you.
Mayor?
Mr. Chair, so I could respond. I mean, we could debate this for a while, but I think we all understand the points that each other are making, and I certainly appreciate the comments that the alderman made. Excuse me. We do have the community center, which is a $30,000 item in the budget. So if no one else wants to continue to discuss participatory budgeting, the community center is a project where we got a ton of people involved. There's been a really great job behind it. We haven't spoken about it too much because we weren't sure if we could put everything together, but we have. Mostly This is Ms. Kleiner's project, and she has really worked very hard on it. So again, if no one has anything else on participatory budgeting, I don't particularly, so we could move on to the community center.
I got a couple people that want to speak.
Oh, they do? Okay.
Alderman Wiltshire.
Sorry, I didn't mean to
bullets.
cut anyone off. I
Not
just,
done with it yet.
what?
Not done with it yet.
I have to agree with the other speakers on the participatory budgeting. I think we have a lot of priorities here in the city. I think there are a lot of people involved in volunteer positions with the city already. And I think we can do more to get more people involved, but as far as assigning a dollar to it, I'm not sure I would support that. I like the idea of the Arlington Street building, however.
Alderman O'Brien.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would just like to say, in basic, I can see where this is a good idea. I do hear from particularly the constituents, maybe 6 people on a regular basis, and I wonder what the other 98,000 are doing, and I think their silence also speaks volumes. But however, what happens if this board, if they're in conflict with us on their priorities, and nobody seems to have addressed that? Who overrules? I mean, we're the legitimate people that make those type of decisions, correct?
I think as proposed, you would have the final say, just like with the Downtown Improvement Committee. I mean, they propose things. We tend to follow their recommendations, but we don't have to, and we don't always. So I think it would be up to you, but,
Alderman Wiltshire.
Well, it's the same thing with review and comment, right? It's a participatory budget, if you will, right? They are given a certain dollar amount, and they come back with their recommendations, and this board approves it. In the 18 years I've been on this board, maybe once they made a change, so that's,
From my standpoint, I certainly could hear the passion in the mayor's voice when he's talking about this, so I know he feels very deeply about it. And as far as citizen participation, I agree with the previous speakers, that's an outstanding thing. One thing kept, every time I was reading these memos and stuff, I'm thinking, okay, we get all these people all excited about spending some amount of money on a project, and that's a good thing, and then they come to the Board of Aldermen and we shoot it down. Now, what happens to that enthusiasm from the public? It could go a couple different ways, we won't get into that, but I'm just concerned about that. Now, we said we're gonna vet it with our staff, okay, and that puts them in the middle. And I'm not comfortable putting them in the middle, but I think it's something to hear more about, maybe to pursue more. I just still have some concerns, and maybe we can iron those out as we go along. But with that, I think we can move in, unless anybody else has anything, we can move into the next project, and
That horse is soap now.
Mr. Chair, the community center, Ms. Kleiner is going to give you all the details. It's been a long time in coming. There are many, we own this building at Arlington Street next to the old fire station, which has been a ballet center, but which has been moribund in that respect for a year or two. We have worked very hard to come up with a community school model that will involve many social service agencies, not the expenditure of city funds, but for the initial capital investment in helping to buy some of the equipment for the center. We already are paying to maintain and heat the building and all that. The number of people, talking about participatory, the number of people who have been involved in this and coming forward with how we can help. The whole point is to help the children and families surrounding Dr. Chris School, where we have a lot of problems with, poverty and single-parent families and things like that. The effort that has been expended has been incredible, and the project has really come into focus and into really good shape. And so I can't say enough about everyone who's been involved. And again, Ms. Kleiner can give you the details.
Ms. Kleiner?
Members of the Board of Aldermen. So this project began shortly after the mayor came into office. It is based around 3 objectives, although those objectives were not, although they were announced by the mayor, they weren't really focused on initiatives that just the mayor himself brought forward, but more objectives that the community and our stakeholders and our various boards brought forward. So you've heard some of them before. Entering school ready to learn, which has been a large focus of the United Way, the YMCA, and the schools. Reading at grade level by 3rd grade, which you have heard is the main objective adopted by the Board of Education. And preventing violence and providing second chances, which has been an objective that the police department has been working on with the Mirror Project and the Red Committee, and in conjunction with the Youth Council here in the city. So these were the 3 objectives that community stakeholders were brought together last May and had a summit on. And after that summit, 3 focus groups were joined, and they met bi-monthly and then monthly to determine a plan. And one of the things that we heard come out clearly during that summit was that Nashua needs to do a better job in coordination of our services. We need to focus on how we coordinate the tremendous services that our city departments offer, along with those services that our community partners offer. And Manchester introduced a community school model last year. So we traveled to Goslar Elementary to look at this model. And the basis of it is simple. They bring their community services and their city services into Goslar Elementary, directly into the school, and make the school the hub of the neighborhood. What they have seen is a tremendous amount of participation in obtaining services that the families need once they're brought within their reach. So using that model, we know that our schools are a little cramped for space. And we looked at whether or not it could be brought into a school, and we found that that would be incredibly difficult to do. So we moved to looking at spaces near schools. One of the reasons that Dr. Chris was isolated as a school in need was when we looked at Dr. Chris, we saw that it had a very high percentage of poverty, about 82%. When we dug deeper into census, we found that although the city's median income for age group, just taking age group 25 to 44 was 75,000. In the Crown Hill area, it dropped to 38. So it gives you a sense of the poverty that's associated in this neighborhood. What we also saw when we looked at iReady scores within the schools, and I'm sure you heard the superintendent and the Board of Education speak about being at grade level, and I believe there were questions asked, what do those percentages look like? At Dr. Chris, 55.1% were more than 1 grade level behind. So that's high for our district. So that's one of the reasons that we chose to look at this neighborhood. As Mayor Doncha said, conveniently, a city building had been vacated by the longtime dance school. And when we went in and looked at the space, we found it would work quite nicely for a community school model. The 3 floors with the office area downstairs, provides not only ample space, but a certain layout that would allow for the flow of different services to operate at the same time. So offering different services at the same time. As the mayor noted, one of the benefits of this project, and we took our time, we went very slow, very carefully, was the amount of community partners that became very engaged and worked hard over the last year to put this plan together. There's a strategic plan located on the website that gives a lot more detail, but we included some detail in a letter from the mayor, along with a list of the community partners that have agreed to serve on a board overseeing the community center. There's also included in the packet areas of focus for the community center. And I just want to say that these areas of focus were arrived at by surveys done within the Dr. Crisp area to families and teachers, as well as surveys that were collected at last fall's back-to-school event. So these areas of focus came from our citizens and from our teachers, and we thank them for that input. Lastly, you'll see a community center in-kind cost for fiscal 18, and as the mayor mentioned, what we're looking for from the capital budget is roughly $30,000 for computers. The computers and having them networked within the community center is vital. They will offer not only job placement, ESL, tutoring, all different types of math programs that we currently use in our schools, offer online tutorials that we can then teach to students off-site, teach to family members. We can also allow people to come in and teach how to resume build. So the computer network is an essential part of that. You'll see here it says $23,000, although we've asked for 30. Our concerns, working with our IT department upstairs, was there's going to be some cabling and some movement of wires and things, so we wanted to leave some room. Although the $23,000 you see here are Dell quotes that we've received with the help of IT. The annual utility costs that you see are costs that are already worked in. These are costs that, through risk, through managing the city building that we already provide. The $5,400 for personnel costs is just maintenance costs that would already be performed by our city maintenance staff, as well as the janitorial supplies associated that they would use and the pest control. The office supply item, the $3,500, would be picked up by the community partners. The thought being that we would take advantage of the city's contract with WB Mason to at least offer them the discount of a larger organization's buying power. The furniture for $4,400 that you see on the top line is actually furniture that has been donated by the library after the Chandler Wing was renovated. They found a great deal of furniture, and it looks as though most of that furniture would fit quite nicely into the community center, including some computer corrals that were left over and they are no longer using. The process for the space being used is that community partners would fill out a request for space. The community center board would then review all those proposals and ultimately look at, are they meeting our objectives? They're providing their staff. They're providing any associated costs with running the program within the center. And in addition, the city gives them this in-kind contribution that they can apply for grants through their various donors. So it's very much a hand-in-hand process, but it is a city building putting up the space.
Okay, question? Alderman McCarthy?
I actually think this is I'm tempted to say, just reading the memo, it's a great exercise in participatory budgeting. The way I would see it working out, which is all the work was done up front and then the proposal was brought to us. I think it's fine. The only question I would ask is, since a lot of the purchases are computers, have we reached out to, say, Dell to see if they're interested as a community resident in supporting this for us?
So we have reached out, and we worked with IT, and they tried their best. Not to say that we won't continue to, but the initial, I have to say that there was a couple of computer printers that were donated. Conway Office Products has offered some things. So there certainly has been a number of donations, but the quotes from Dell were relatively low in comparison to what would normally be offered.
Did you have your hand up before? I thought I saw you. Alderman Siegel?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I agree with Alderman McCarthy. This is a lot more palatable, clearly a benefit. I appreciate this. It might be helpful. The only concern I have about this magic panacea of computers is that on one level, there's definitely skills that can be developed and used, resume building. But when you actually look at what the computers are used for, it's more like doing the whole YouTube thing. And I guess, and I'm in favor of doing this, but I really fear for the lack of interaction. You know, people just glue themselves to screens, and that substitutes for learning or something. So, again, this is short money, and it's clearly a good idea to support this. But let's be careful about calling this some sort of great miracle worker.
Alderman Showman, then Alderman Wiltshire.
Thank you. I like the idea too. I think having a community center, community involvement is really key. I think it's great. How many computers are we talking about for the $30,000 roughly?
We are talking for about 9.
Okay. And is the computer use supervised computer use? Is it training that someone is working with them, or is it, as Alderman Siegel implied, just kind of using it for whatever they want to do? How does that work?
So, sure. So what we have found is in all of the programs that have initially been looked at have been offered by community partners. One of the things that the schools is working on, and certainly we're very thankful to our police department and our school system for the tremendous amount of work that they've done over the past year, helping us put this together. They're looking at providing teachers, both retired and teachers currently, as tutors to walk through these computer programs with parents and with students. The Adult Learning Center that provides ESL classes would walk classes through on the computers with the Rosetta Stone, which helps to the English language learning. They also, the Adult Learning Center, also does a program as far as resume building and job searching. So many of the programs, although I'm not going to say that there wouldn't be any free computer use, but most of the programs would be very structured programs offered by our community partners.
Follow up, Alderman Showman?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that. This then is the entire budget that would come from the city, the $8,600, the $54, the $12, and the $1,000, those utility costs, personnel, janitorial supplies, and pest control, because these are costs we already have
Correct.
on that building. So there's nothing else that the city is being asked to provide other than this capital this year. I'm glad to know that, too. Is there any plan for how we're going to measure the activity level here? Are we going to keep track of how many people come in and receive services? What the results are, how many resumes built? How are we going to keep track of that so that in a year's time, we can look back and say, this has worked, or we got to tweak it a little bit, or what?
Absolutely. One of the things that the executive committee has been charged with is exactly that, tracking once the community center opens, which we hoped would be sometime in September, tracking it for a year in order to come back and give you data that substantiates the city not only putting the initial investment of the $30,000, but also the use of the building. And also so that we can find out what programs work, what programs don't, what we need to help our citizens with and our families with that we may not offer now. So it would be evaluated on a yearly basis by the committee.
Okay. Alderman Wiltshire?
Thank you. I'd like to thank you for your work on this too, Kim. This is a really, really good community idea. I mean, bringing services into a neighborhood that's really changed so much over the last 10 years or so. I think it's the school with the highest level of kids that qualify for free and reduced lunch. So bringing these services to this neighborhood for not just the kids, but for the families is so important to that neighborhood. The only one thing oh, never mind, I just saw it. I was going to say, I noticed the United Way wasn't on there, but they're down at the bottom. So kudos to you and to all these people. I think this is a great makeup of community partners, stakeholders here. It's a pretty impressive list. I looked at it and I go, wow, well, them and them and them. It's pretty good. It's a good idea, and thanks for bringing it to us.
Alderman O'Brien and Alderman McCarthy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Previous life, very familiar with both buildings, but 36, being captain of the house when 38 was the fire station, there was many a night, I wish we lived at 36 as compared to 38, but that's the way things were at that particular time. So I'm very excited about this, particularly in my time being in the Crown Hill neighborhood. I think this goes very far in addressing a lot of the things, with that community, and it's definitely within the need. But what I don't see here is what's going to happen with 38. And I know we're talking apples and oranges here, but the thing is, 38, where it was a fire station, is not really viable. It was a good house. I loved it dearly, particularly when it rained out and water came pouring down the walls. But the point is, you've got to do something nice here, and you've got a derelict building right next door.
Mrs. Kleiner?
So I would have to defer to Director Cummings on 38 Arlington Street.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Alderman O'Brien. You make an excellent point, and it is not. It is definitely not far from my mind. I do know that this is going to be something like actually the Court Street Theater. I will be coming to you and the board to address in the near future. Because I think it is an underperforming asset for the city, and I think we have a fiduciary responsibility to try to do something to create a higher and better use for that structure, which had a great purpose in its day, but I think it's surplus now, and we need to figure out what we want to do with it. So to answer your question directly, it's on my short order of lists to bring before you.
Follow-up?
Yeah, and if I may, just for point of interest, I do hope that the cabling is there. I know at 38 it was, and I hope it's still viable, that it could transfer over. I don't know if you know it, but those two buildings are connected with a tunnel underneath.
Yes.
I spent a lot of time there.
Yes.
But just so that the people don't know, both had a very strong history as protection for the city. They were both fire stations at one time. The building we're talking about did hold the horses in it, and the reason they built the new one next door is because the apparatus without the horses was too much bigger, so they had to go to a bigger place, so that was it. But very historical in a sense, yeah.
Alderman McCarthy?
So Alderman O'Brien, are you saying that when we gave you dominion over a self-cleaning fire station, you turned it into a derelict?
We didn't have to wash the walls, yes.
I highly doubt that the cabling that's in there is likely to be useful, so I suspect you'll wind up replacing it. I guess the only question I have doesn't actually have to do with this proposal, but with the conditions that lead us to this, which is Dr. Crisp's school. And I know the Board of Ed has taken some actions over there, but do we believe that the problem is solely the economic conditions in Crown Hill that causes the problem, or is there an underlying issue with that school that the Board of Ed really needs to address that would diminish the conditions that get us into this in the first place?
Ms. Kleiner?
So, it's known now that there is a new principal joining Dr. Crisp. That Sherry Fulton has been working with our committee even before it was ever known that she would be applying for that position. It has a very strong base of very dedicated teachers. But some of the concerns that we have seen are mainly driven, or what you would see driven by a low income area. There also has been a very high in resettlement of refugees in that area of the city versus other areas of the city. So when you have those language barriers and other things that come with the resettlement and the adjustment into a new way of living, you often see concerns. What we haven't seen is them travel. So Dr. Crisp is a walking school. They walk their children to school, but they don't tend to use as much of the city transportation as we see, and we don't see a lot of movement out of the Dr. Crisp area into the city to obtain the services. So really bringing those services right next to the school, and the thought is we're going to be in the school, out on the sidewalk as they're walking by, giving pamphlets, because it's easy and you've dropped off your child at school. Come on in and see what we can offer you right here. And we think that's going to be the key that is going to drive any really community impact.
Alderman Schoneman?
Thank you. I think one of the things that we have to consider whenever we do something like this, and we look at the demographics of the city or refugee resettlement or the economic issues, if we are bringing services there, are we in the end going to make an improvement, or are we going to draw more customers for those services and really facilitate the need rather than facilitate the solution?
Ms. Kleiner?
So I'd be careful because you're going to pay for that one way or another. What you're seeing now is the schools struggle with the costs of very basic education because they're already providing some of these other services that may not be educationally related. So we're paying for it in the costs of other services that the schools are struggling with, and programs that we're having to put in place to catch people up when they're falling behind. The idea is if you can provide these services that definitely impact their ability to learn, then are we not having children fall behind grade level? Are we allowing our citizens in that area to find jobs and learn new skills, which ultimately helps the city as a whole? The The idea is not to raise costs by giving new programs. It's just more of a reallocation of programs that we already offer within the city.
Just one other quick follow-up, may I? Will this alleviate some of the burden on the schools then? Is that the idea?
That is a primary goal.
Thank you.
Mayor, did you want to chime in?
I just wanted to mention that in kind of talking to people about this over time, you get a comment from the youth council, for example, like if a family is referred over there for some kind of counseling or help or drug counseling, whatever it is, that just that distance from, say, Dr. Crisp to the youth council, a lot of the people that are suggesting, hey, you should go over there, they just never make it. Whereas the community school model in Manchester demonstrates that if the youth council goes to the place right next to the school, the family who's bringing the kid to school or whatever, or is already around the school, is much more likely to participate in an available program that this community already offers, rather than just ignore it. The need already exists, but they're more likely to participate if there's geographical, if the service is near the school where they're already involved.
Alderman McCarthy.
Yeah, I wanted to comment that the mayor and I have been participating in the Welcoming Cities Initiative, which had its last formal meeting this afternoon, and a lot of the discussion in there had to do with things like education and the fact that the major problem is our services are fragmented and we don't know where the potential clients are. It sounds like the good news is you've found them, and we're dealing with the problem of how to make sure that that understanding of the breadth of services that are available and where they're available gets fixed by putting them all in one place. So I actually think this goes a long way to helping with some of those issues, both for our newcomer population and for people who are here that may have difficulties. So I think this is a great idea.
Alderman O'Brien.
Thank you. And my comment would be, being very familiar with the neighborhood, if you look at the architecture in the Crown Hill section, a lot of it was probably at one time single-family homes, but they have been divided up into multifamily, type of usage or apartments and everything, and it lends itself to a certain type of clientele and is filling the needs. There's also to be mentioned that there is housing, major drive area that is there, and it's all within walking distance of Burke Street, where the girls' club is there and everything else. So I'm very excited about this. It could go a long way to maybe help strengthen the neighborhood, maybe at some future point. But I'd like to keep the neighborhood in a way that it is viable for, people that come in and, need of affordable housing. And that school in that Crown Hill area seems to fill that void and make our city healthy. This would be a great asset to help these people in that neighborhood, and I think it's a good idea.
3 quick questions. Is it handicap accessible? Is there enough parking? And what's the next step to make this happen?
So on the handicap accessible,
Is that relevant to the line item in the budget, though?
If we can't use it, it would be.
so the first floor of the community center, which would hold the majority of the programming, is handicap accessible. In fact, DPW has been putting a small ramp to allow access into that first floor there. The downstairs is not handicap accessible, although that would only be used for office space and for community partners to house the various resources that they would need to access to offer programming. The third floor is currently not handicap accessible, but that floor would be using primarily, it's a large dance floor, and they would be providing programs such as the movement programs, the exercise programs, some self-defense classes, some of the things that you would generally see people of moving.
Okay, and you have adequate parking, do you feel, for,
Adequate parking, there's parking behind. Also, we're working with the school, the Dr. Chris School, where on nights and weekends, we would access their parking lot. But we do feel that most of the residents that would be coming were walking. They're walking to Dr. Chris, so we don't have a major concern at the moment. And I'm sorry, your third
And-
question, Alderman?
what's the next step to implementing this that you're asking us to take?
The next step for us would be actually putting out the purchase order for the computers and getting those ordered. Currently, we're sending out the requests for the space for the community partners to fill out and then for the executive committee to review and process. Once the computers come in, we can get those cabled up and the furniture moved and start with programming.
Alderman O'Brien?
Thank you. There's one question. You said the third floor is going to get involved with this. I know there's a fire escape in the back that goes up to floor number 2. Does it go to floor number 3?
It does.
Okay. So there won't be any additional occupancy issue. Beautiful.
So if we want to move forward with this, I guess ask the mayor, what action do we need to take, if any, here at budget?
Just approve the capital improvements budget with this in it.
Okay.
And that will enable the computers to be purchased, and everything else is already in the works.
Okay. Alderman Siegel?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So we have nothing to do with that, so that we leave that alone. So I'd like to make a motion, okay? I'd like to make a motion that the $200,000 participatory citizens fund be transferred to the police expendable trust, overtime expendable trust fund.
Okay, the motion on the floor is to take the $200,000 from the participatory budget process and allocate it to police overtime. Discussion? Alderman Shoneman?
I just have a question for Alderman Siegel. Do you believe that's more important than the radios?
Alderman Siegel?
The problem with the radios is it's a zero line item right now, and the expendable trust fund is not. You can transfer money according to, am I correct, Alderman McCarthy? It's-
Not, well,
Alderman McCarthy?
there's a zero line item which we increased to $100,000 the other day. That actually, we could have simultaneously reduced this one by $200,000. Either of those actions causes the budget to require 10 votes to pass after it's amended.
Alderman Siegel?
I think the radios are important. I think that some things are going to be done out of fund balance. So I'm just saying, let's leave it in for right now, or just put it in the expendable trust fund for police overtime. I believe that's something that everybody can get behind, fairly straightforward, and the radios will come out of the surplus. But here's the thing, the radio contract may be renegotiated potentially, but the expendable trust fund has to get replenished. I mean, we're in trouble there. So that was my thinking.
So just for clarification, you're talking about transferring this to the 2018 budget, which won't help the police department's overtime this year? Or are we getting the 2 years mixed up?
Oh, it's going forward, replenishing the fund going forward in the budget that we're about to.
Though we
that
said
we'll-
it's zero now.
It's,
Oh, well, okay, I guess we don't have a lot of time left, yeah, so, okay.
right.
Discussion, further discussion?
Maybe I could ask a question
Griffin.
and potentially work with Alderman McCarthy. As I recall, Alderman Siegel, that particular transfer essentially through the budget process set up the expendable trust fund in fiscal 16. They didn't use it in 16.
Correct.
17, it's not even appearing in the, where it would be properly located, transfers in and out. So subject to check. I think what you're suggesting is you take the 200,000, you reduce the capital improvement budget, and you increase what's Department 196, which is the transfers in and out. So I just don't know if that creates an increase in 196 such that you need the 10 votes, but I'm just trying to be clear.
My feeling is we'll find out. If somebody wants to vote against it, they'll vote against it. We need money in the overtime fund. I mean, we have a crime wave.
Alderman McCarthy?
Mr. Griffin, where are you saying it should go?
I would think it would go page 260.
Explicit line item for the expendable trust fund.
I don't think there is currently an item to put money into the trust fund in the budget. Oh, I see. So you're saying put it in a transfer account, which isn't there at the moment. So we would add an 89 account to Department 198.
I could definitely check and get back on the wrap-up, but, I mean, I understand the intent of what you're trying to accomplish.
Further discussion? If not, all those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Any other discussion? All right. Okay,
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
all right, thank you. So, unfinished business,
There is none.
new business,
There is none.
general discussion.
Haven't we had enough?
Okay, no need for public comment, there's no public, remarks by Alderman. Alderman Shoneman.
Just want to remind people that this Saturday is Young Eagles at the airport. I'm not sure of the times. I believe it's 10 a.m. to 2 p.m., but if anyone's interested in free airplane rides for their children, head out to the airport, and you can look on the airport website for more information.
Okay, any other? Okay, tonight is the last actual run-through with departments on the city budget. The next meeting we have is the public hearing on Tuesday at Nashua High North on the budget. And then after that, on Thursday, June 8th, there's a wrap-up session. And there are tentative wrap-up sessions for Thursday, June 15th and Monday, June 19th. And then at the latest, it would be the 27th for the second reading of the budget motion. Any questions? Do I hear a motion? Alderman Siegel.
Adjourn.
Motion to adjourn. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. We're adjourned at 9:02 PM.